This is my most recent shipping container cabin. It's got stairs, rooftop deck, it's got an awning and a water collection system. It's got a handmade window, some neat interior features. Stick around and I'll show you how I put it together.
I'll walk you through this build in 10 steps, with step 1 just being getting the container level. Step 2 is to get all the welding done, with one caveat I'll mention later. I'm building the stairs first. The end of a container is an 8 foot by 8 foot square, which perfectly accommodates a piece of square tubing sitting at a 45-degree angle. Then, using angle steel to hold up the stair treads, the rest of the staircase proceeds logically. They say you can't know true happiness until you've felt a tack weld gain purchase on a sketchily held workpiece. Were it but that all men should feel that tuning fork ring in their loins, if not but once in their lifetime. I'll add the permanent treads after painting, but for now some temporary treads will allow me to start working on the roof. In case you're wondering, these stairs aren't too springy. They're only 2 feet wide, a little bit less than normal, which should make them a little more firm.
This is a good time to stop and talk about why I do all the welding first. The reason is the welds burn through the metal from one side to the other. So if you're welding on the outside, you don't want to have anything on the inside that can catch on fire. This is the other side of the container from where I built the staircase. And you can see all of these burn marks are where the metal got hot on the inside. I should also point out that I'm building this container at a little property I have near my house, but it's not the container's final site. So there are a couple things I won't be able to finish until I get it finally moved.
Now, continuing with the roof welding. I want to develop a cheap and simple system for collecting rainwater off the roof of these containers, while at the same time keeping water off the doors and windows. I welded up these two obtuse triangles. No easy task for my dumb math brain. And these are held closed by hinges until the container reaches its final site. Once that happens, I'll open them back up and build an awning on top. On the roof, I built a water collection system underneath a deck. The deck is held up by square tubing welded to the top of the container. I collect water by just running some old barn tin at a slope to the back of the container. Cut some more obtuse angles out of some old 2x4s. That allow that barn tin to slope. And then just screw those 2x4s down to the container. With the welding done up there, and before going any further, I always want to get the roof coated with some elastomeric. And since we're focusing on the roof, I'll interrupt my step 2 welding process to show you the rest of the roof build. With that water collection system in place, I can now build my decks. I'm building 2 decks. This is a 12-foot deck that's elevated about 6 inches off the container to allow room for that water collection system underneath. Over by the stairs, I have an 8-foot long deck that's not elevated. And the reason for that is when you come up the stairs, you don't want to have to step up very high. So there's a lower 8-foot deck coming off the stairs, followed by a 12-foot long deck covering the water collection system. Here's a peek at how the awning will look. It still needs to be squared up and welded together, but it'll have a slight downslope so rainwater pitches on to the container roof and then drains to the back. Next, I'll continue the welding with the door and windows. In building this container, I came up with what I think is a pretty good plan if you don't know exactly where you want your doors and windows to go. And that is to tack weld your window and door frames to the outside so you can get a good look and see how it's going to look once they're installed. I like all kinds of containers, but used containers built with salvage materials initially got me interested in this game. Those tend to tickle my creative bone a little bit more than your standard container cabin. And I'll be building this one with one found window, a found door, a new window, and a window that I made basically from scratch. I find a lot of these gross old grid windows and sliding glass doors. I wanted to know whether it'd be worth it to take one apart and build something new. Took me a little trial and error to figure out how to take these things apart, but once I got the hang, it was no issue. I've also been lucky enough to come into a lifetime supply of rebar, which you'll see used several times if you watch closely. I took that rebar and welded it to the inside of the window frame, and then just made a double pane window by attaching glass to each side. People always want to know the best way to cut holes for doors and windows. If you don't have or want to use a cutting torch, your options are a circular saw, a jigsaw, and an angle grinder. And I've always found a circular saw too unwieldy for this job. So my choices are a jigsaw and an angle grinder. And just remember, if you think you need 5 jigsaw blades and 5 cutoff discs, buy about 50 of each. They go fast.
For a little awning for the back windows,
I'm trying a 10-foot long by 8 inches wide piece of flat steel. My old man taught me that just about all of life's problems can be solved with an empty 5-gallon bucket, a cinder block, a jack, and a 2x4. And here, half of those materials help me hoist this thing into place. Not a huge fan of this. It's a little bit cumbersome and dangerous for one guy. And it's basically just a big fettuccine noodle that's not quite flat.
now let's finish up any outside welding with an understanding that the amateur welder is kindred in spirit to the 5-year-old with a glue stick. Everything must be glued. Now before totally finishing out our step 2 welding, we need to jump ahead to step 3, which is to frame the container.
You can see that I've got the studs turned sideways, so the frame is only 1.5 inches thick. You can't run plumbing or electricity if you do that, but it obviously gives you more space.
Here I made a bit of a mistake by just pushing these frame panels up against the wall and not measuring the floor and ceiling to make sure everything was square. This is necessary because the container might not be square and your frame might not be square. And if your frame's a little tweaked, then that'll affect your flooring and your siding.
I had 3 leftover 6x6s from my last project. And while they provide no structural support in a container, I thought they'd be pretty cool. The hard part was getting them up there. I've been asked a handful of times how to secure the frame to the container, but what I tell people is either just screw it into a window frame or weld something to the container that you can screw the frame into. And with those final welds,
We complete steps 2 and 3, welding and framing.
here's a look at the final frame. It's a bit more complicated than it has to be because of those 3 6x6 rafters that I put in. Here the steps can move around a little bit, but I'll make step 4, adding the door,
Since it probably makes sense to finish the framing before putting the door on.
I was pretty adamant about using this artistic metal screen door that I found, but it's much smaller in width than the door, so I had to do some modifications to make it fit. Also, I don't have enough room for both doors to have handles on them, so I really had to think this one through and ultimately cut a space off of the screen door for the handle on the main door to fit through. Because I thought that looked a little goofy, I filled it in with a little bit of Texas flair. All of this amounted to a pretty good amount of frustrating work. It could only be justified by unnecessarily taking too much Adderall, which alas was not the case.
The next step is the spray foam installation, which I think it makes sense to do before painting the outside. I called around and the best price I could get was $1,300 for 1 inch. 2 inches was exactly twice as much, which I thought was a bizarre pricing structure. Evidently all the labor is in that first inch. The next step is to prep and paint the container. Now, a lot of the stickers are easily removed by heat and a razor scraper. The big stickers on the side are often another story. I've tried a lot of things and the weed burner is about the best you can do. But you're going to take the paint off underneath the sticker. That's okay, with enough sanding you could hide where the stickers were. But I also spend time now trying to see if I can incorporate any of the existing stickers into the final build. I've got a couple options on some hunting land where I'm thinking about putting this container. But those options are in native prairie grass land. So I went with a paint called Sweetgrass to make this thing sort of blend in. The next step is to add the flooring, and this is some 2¼ inch red oak that I salvaged from someone's yard on bulk trash day.
I've been searching for an interior siding that I can call my own. And I started watching videos and reading about the use of plywood as an interior siding material. And this is an approach where you put a spacing or a relief between the pieces of plywood. You basically glue them to the 2x4 studs and then put tiny brad nails in them, so it looks like they're floating up against the frame. The only difference with the ceiling is that I put some actual screws in them, since gravity's working against me. I didn't feel like taping off the 6x6s in the windows, so I hit it with a roller and then came back and hit some spots with the paint sprayer. Now the finishing touches. If you're planning a container cabin, it kind of makes sense to figure out where the bed fits first and then go from there. My idea was to put the bed in the back where there are no windows on any side. The idea with the 2 back windows is that I'd be able to hunt out of the back of one, and the other, closer to the bed, would hold the window AC unit. I built a bathroom in my last container, but I never use it, so why not just put a rudimentary toilet in there? Paint it gold, which seems like the only choice, although I have no idea why. I set up the electric on this so that it could be plugged into a generator. Or if I take it to a site that has power, which is unlikely, I could put a breaker box on the outside. The wiring is simple. It feeds to a light switch by the door, which then feeds over around by the bed to an outlet and to a light up above. This seems like a good place to stop. Next time I'll get it moved and finished out. See you then.